Today at the National Press Club, the international president of Médecins Sans Frontières, Dr. Christos Christou. His organisation delivers emergency medical aid in about 70 countries, and he'll discuss how their response is being challenged by current conflicts. Dr. Christos Christou with today's Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and the Westpac address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Anna Henderson. I'm Chief Political Correspondent for SBS World News and a board member here at the club. Our guests today are Dr. Christos Christou, Médecins Sans Frontières International President, and the Executive Director of MSF Australia, Jennifer Tierney. Christos will deliver the main address, and he was born in a small town in central Greece. He graduated from Aristotle University's medical school and holds a PhD in surgery. He also holds a master's degree in international health with a focus on health crisis management from the University of Athens. He joined MSF in 2002 and has since held several roles. His first assignment was in Greece as a field doctor working with migrants and refugees. He then worked as a doctor in HIV/AIDS projects in Zambia in 2004 and 2005. After a break from international work, during which he trained as a surgeon, Dr. Christou rejoined MSF in 2013 for assignments in a number of conflict zones in insecure contexts, including South Sudan, Iraq, and most recently Cameroon, as an emergency and trauma surgeon. Since 2005, he served as the General Secretary, Vice President, and finally President of MSF's Greek Board of Directors. He was elected as International President in June 2019. He's about to deliver his address, and you can follow this conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Dr. Christos Christou.
Thank you. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today, both in the room and in online. It is a privilege to be here, and I express my thanks to the National Press Club for this opportunity. I'm honored to speak to you today about the limits of the humanitarian action. I will focus on two critical humanitarian crises of our time: the wars in Gaza and Sudan. As I speak, Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, teams in Gaza are responding to the latest attack. An Israeli airstrike on tents in a camp for displaced people in Rafah. This is unimaginable. These are people who followed evacuation orders to leave northern Gaza, only to be bombed in the south. What could more clearly show that there is nowhere safe in Gaza? MSF is doing what we can to care for 180 people injured in this attack. We are working from a very small clinic in a shed, and what we can do is limited because the Gazan healthcare system has been dismantled, piece by piece, hospital by hospital by hospital. There were 36 functional hospitals in Gaza before the war. Now, only 9 are partially functioning. Hospitals and healthcare are sacred spaces. They are protected by international humanitarian law, the rules of war. This is what allows MSF to do our work in conflict zones. And yet in Gaza, we are seeing over and over again that these principles are eroded. They are becoming meaningless. MSF is a medical humanitarian organization, but in Gaza, that has offered us no protection. Instead, we have faced a pattern of attacks. We have endured 23 violent incidents since 7th October. Our teams were repeatedly told to move south, and when we did, our convoy was fired upon, killing 2 people. Tanks have fired at our shelters. Our vehicles have been bulldozed. Over 260 humanitarian workers have been killed in this war, including the tragic loss of the Australian aid worker Zomi Franco, who was working for World Central Kitchen. Humanitarians were killed while providing care or while sheltering with their families. We are also mourning the loss of 5 MSF colleagues who have been killed in Gaza since 7 October. Mohammed Al-Halel, lab technician. Ala Al-Shawa, volunteer nurse. Dr. Mahmoud Abu Nujala, Dr. Ahmad Al-Sahar, and Reem Abu Lebde, physiotherapist and MSF United Kingdom board member. I share these names of our colleagues with you because they deserve respect and recognition. They are parents, doctors, carers. We are outraged and saddened that they have been killed, and we demand accountability for their deaths. Sadly, these attacks on healthcare are not isolated only to Gaza. Our teams in the West Bank have also witnessed repeated instances where healthcare has been hindered during raids by Israeli forces. They have witnessed the targeting of ambulances and medical staff and acts of violence and killing, even within hospitals. I visited the occupied territories of Palestine in December. I visited Jenin, Nablus, and Ramallah, and worked closely with my colleagues in Gaza. I was in Jenin when an incursion started. I was shocked to see the hospital's entrance blocked by Israeli soldiers, preventing anyone, including the injured, from entering. There's nothing worse for a doctor than to know that people need medical care and you cannot reach them, or they cannot reach you. These raids are happening more regularly these days. Just last week, there was another incursion on a hospital in Jenin. This time, it lasted 2 days and 2 nights and killed 12 people. Israel has offered no accountability for any of the attacks on healthcare facilities. In Gaza, the systematic destruction of the healthcare system means people are unable to receive the medical care they need, either for acute or chronic conditions or pregnancy. While more than 35,000 people have been directly killed in Gaza, there are thousands of other that we call silent deaths. People escaped the bombs only to be killed by infected wounds, chronic diseases, or malnutrition. More than 79,000 have been injured, and an estimated 10,000 remain under rubble. The Israeli government is pursuing a policy of deliberate deprivation, only allowing a trickle of food and water to enter Gaza. People are unable to access adequate food. They are simply starving. MSF has worked in Gaza for 36 years, and this is the first time we've seen cases of malnutrition. Our teams have had to rapidly retrain, as they haven't treated malnutrition before. It's also important to recall that prior to 7 October, there was already a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip caused by Israel's 16-year blockade. The day before this latest escalation of war, MSF was attending to patients wounded in previous escalations. This included patients with long-term injuries sustained in the Great March of Return in 2018 and 2019. The current siege by Israel is stopping the entry of fuel and medicines. Since the closure of the Rafah border in early May, barely any essential humanitarian aid and medical aid has been able to enter. The situation in Gaza has never been so dire. The food, water, and medical supplies so desperately needed are sitting just across the border in Egypt, of use to no one. The US has also recently announced a temporary floating pier to bring aid in. But this is a glaring distraction from the real problem: Israel's indiscriminate and disproportionate military campaign. There would be no need for such creative solutions if Israel stopped its bombardment and punishing siege. There would be no need if Israel opened its borders and allowed for the safe the distribution of aid within Gaza. As part of the international community, Australia should insist on an immediate humanitarian access using the roads and entry points that already exist. Humanitarian aid is something of an illusion in Gaza right now. Yes, MSF is conducting and is continuing to work in Gaza. We will continue to stand by our patients and our more than 400 Palestinian staff. This is our basic act of solidarity. This is how we defend humanity. We are working in 2 hospitals, really at this right moment, Al-Aqsa Hospital, Nasser Hospital, 1 clinic in Gaza City, and 5 primary healthcare facilities, including 3 in Al-Mawasi, in Rafah area, and 2 in Gaza's middle area. We are also recently opening a trauma stabilization point in Tal al-Sultan in Rafah. We are supporting thousands of patients each week with primary health care, mental health care, and maternal health care. Every wound that we stitch, every baby that we deliver safely, every child that we vaccinate makes our presence worthwhile. And yet, the work that we are doing is less than a drop in the vast ocean of need. Let us not have the illusion that there is a meaningful humanitarian response in Gaza right now. The International Court of Justice ruled in January that Israel needs to take steps to prevent plausible genocide in Gaza. The court said Israel must take all measures to stop killing Palestinians in Gaza and must allow sufficient humanitarian assistance. But what we are witnessing is that this ruling is being blatantly ignored. Recently, the ICJ issued another ruling for Israel to halt its offensive on Rafah. Within a few days, Israel bombed the tents for displaced people in Rafah, and these are the news that we all woke up to yesterday morning. Honestly, I have run out of words. I wish I could find the words to express the smell of infected wounds, the cries of mothers who lost their children, the constant sound of drones, the level of desperation of my colleagues. Instead, I will rely on the words of my Australian colleague, psychologist Scarlett Wong. Scarlett is here today, having just returned from Gaza last month. She has told me the story of one of our Palestinian colleagues, a psychologist who lost her entire family. She was the last one with their name, her father, mother, sisters and brothers, nieces and nephews, all gone. She still showed up to work the next day, the very next day. She said working was better than sitting alone in her tent, grieving. As a father, doctor, humanitarian, but mostly as a human being, I'm appalled by the continued and complete disregard for life we are witnessing in Gaza. MSF is frankly horrified by Israel's assault on Gaza, and we remain horrified by Hamas' attack on Israel on 7th October. We feel the pain and the suffering of people in Israel whose family members were killed or taken hostage on 7 October. We feel the suffering of families of those arbitrarily detained from Gaza and the West Bank. What is needed is an immediate and sustained ceasefire. A ceasefire is crucial to prevent further civilian deaths. It's crucial to allow aid in. In Australia and New Zealand, more than 85,000 people have added their voices to our statement of support for a ceasefire in Gaza. Globally, MSF spoke at the United Nations Security Council, demanding an immediate and enduring ceasefire. While the United Nations Security Council has finally voted for this ceasefire, Israel is blatantly ignoring this resolution. It continues its attacks on civilians and medical personnel and is expanding attacks in Rafah every moment that we talk. This is about impunity, a total disregard of the laws of war. And now it must become about accountability. I think Australia has an important role to play. Beyond words, Australia must take immediate concrete actions to hold Israel into account. Australia must apply appropriate sanctions on Israel, as it would to any other global state that refuses to comply with UN Security Council resolutions. The Australian government's expressed support for a ceasefire rings hollow when they are supplying the weapons that continue to kill and maim in Gaza. But even if and when a ceasefire in Gaza finally happens, the road to recovery will be long and uncertain, spanning years, if not decades. Gaza's health system is shattered. On a different continent, we see parallels in Sudan, as it is ravaged by a brutal civil war. The conflict has compounded extreme levels of suffering across the country. Needs are growing every day. The humanitarian response is deeply inadequate, with assistance systematically blocked by the authorities. Almost 7 million people have been internally displaced, and over 2 million have sought refuge in neighboring countries. In Darfur, there are reports of ethnically targeted violence, with mass graves discovered. Refugees describe horrific violence, including looting, burning of homes, and of course, sexual violence. More than 745,000 Sudanese, mostly women and children, have fled this extreme violence over the past year and found refuge in eastern Chad. As our teams respond on the ground, it was important for me to see for myself, to grasp the reality of the situation. So in March, I visited Sudan and Chad. It was an eye-opening. I started my visit in Adre, in eastern Chad, the entry point for most of the refugees from Sudan. I followed the journey they go through. At every stage, MSF teams provide medical assistance as close as possible to refugees, the Chadian returnees, and the local communities. I was surprised to see that after more than a year, MSF is still the main organization providing what? Water and sanitation. There's just not enough humanitarian response. And people are receiving far less water than they need. People often arrived with gunshot wounds and other violence-related injuries, and at times our colleagues treated hundreds of war-wounded patients in one day. Like other towns along the Chad-Sudan border, Adre has been struggling to accommodate the high number of newly arrived refugees. Access to food and medical care was already limited before their arrival. This little village in the middle of the desert has seen its population quadruple since the outbreak of war. Today, more than 120,000 refugees are living there, in such a poor place. They struggle to access basic services and live in unacceptable conditions, which exacerbate on their health risks. I took the time to speak to different people in the communities, including also our patients. The suffering, the hardship they endure is heartbreaking, but they show great resilience and strength. And you can see that in the face of all this such adversity. They shared with me how they used to have a normal life before. I remember a man in tears explaining to me that after all the horror we've been through, I imagined we'd find comfort here. But we are reduced to begging every day for food. People have lost everything, their loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods. They explained to me how they had only two options: flee to Chad or be killed. These words echoed in my mind. What more can we do? This crisis may not grab headlines or trend on social media, but it demands our attention and our action. The humanitarian response is woefully inadequate. I describe what I saw as a humanitarian desert, because there is a palpable lack of aid organizations on the ground. We have persistently called for an escalation of the humanitarian response, yet commitments continue to fall short. The funding projections for this year are not optimistic. Much more needs to be done in Eastern Chad, and this is part of our moral duty. There is no excuse for the international community not to act and support the Sudanese who fled extreme violence, treating them with respect, the respect that they deserve. A few days later, I crossed the border from Chad into Sudan. After just a 30-minute drive into Darfur, you immediately see the horrific amount of destruction that has taken place in Al Janina. Entire neighborhoods have been destroyed. There are houses without their roof and bullet holes in buildings. Part of the city looks like a ghost town. In Salenki, people shared with me a horrific story of a patient and surgeon getting shot at while the doctor was operating. Although the doctor survived, the patient died. Armed men stole all the equipment from the hospital. They even threw patients out of beds just to take the beds with them. I heard stories from the dialysis unit where the machines people relied on for life-saving care were just unplugged. These are blatant breaches of international humanitarian law, and yet, shockingly, they are not unusual incidents. MSF has experienced looting and violence across Sudan. For a year, MSF has seen the systematic political obstruction of life-saving humanitarian assistance. Very few international staff have been given visas to enter Sudan to support local staff. Life-saving supplies are blocked from entering Khartoum, the capital. In Wad Madani, we've been left no choice but to halt our work because we can't get life-saving supplies in. Humanitarian assistance from Chad to Sudan is not being properly facilitated and allowed through. And yet people are dying from being unable to access health care. We see catastrophic rates of malnutrition in places like Zamzam camp, where one child dies every hour from a lack of food. This exceptional crisis requires an exceptional response by the international community, not the brazen ignorance we are seeing. Before the start of the war, there were dozens of international organizations responding across the country. Now there are almost none. For a crisis of this scale, this is unfathomable. It is unacceptable. There is no doubt that there are enormous challenges in Sudan, but they are not insurmountable. We have a moral obligation and responsibility to continue to do everything we can to bring attention to this. As the world faces numerous complex humanitarian tragedies, humanity itself is under attack. MSF will continue to stand by our patients, to alleviate their suffering and restore their dignity. We will continue to work as doctors, as humanitarians, and as human beings. We will continue to bear witness and speak out, always based on our medical humanitarian action. But there are limits to humanitarianism. We can call for a ceasefire, but we cannot stop the war. We cannot stop attacks on hospitals and patients. We cannot open borders to allow aid in. These are political responsibilities. We will continue to stress the collective responsibility of the UN Security Council and its members, including Australia, to protect and uphold the rules of war. This underpins all the work that we do. Without it, we can't safeguard the lives of patients and our staff. More than being protected, these rules need to be rebuilt. We need to see stronger measures for holding states and warring parties to account when they are breached. We will continue to call for the protection and amplification of voices both within our teams and independent and impartial journalists who report on these atrocities far beyond the headlines. The complete indifference to humanitarian laws in Gaza and Sudan without any accountability makes our world a terrifying place. A place where violence is uncontested and civilians unprotected. The ramifications of this impunity will echo across generations and across the world. We have a collective responsibility to do all we can to stand on the side of humanity. All and each one of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christou, for your address, and thanks for joining us as well, Jennifer. In terms of, I guess, one of the first things that comes to mind after hearing what you've had to say there, I was just reviewing the MSF Charter, just to sort of, I guess, apprise myself of, you know, the obligations that MSF sees itself as under when dealing with international conflicts. Because in that address you have spoken about, you know, the responsibility you see the Australian government as having, calling for sanctions to be put on Israel, and I guess would like to understand how you see that fitting in with the charter of MSF, given there is a view and in your own charter a suggestion that there's an idea of neutrality and impartiality in everything you do. So why have you taken this step?
The first thing in our charter is the medical action. This is our basic act of solidarity. A medical action that is always and wherever possible combined by testimonials, bearing witness and advocating about what we see. Becoming, in other words, the voices of the people that we are there to support. And then, of course, we have to do that as doctors. Doctors mean that we always impartially assess the needs. And we choose to go there where most of the needs exist. And we do that also thanks to our financial independence, and always within the spirit of neutrality. But if we follow this order, and we are in extremely challenging situations, exceptional crises, like the ones that I described before, what matters is again to stand by the people, no matter what this means. Sometimes we may feel that we cross some lines, but we never cross the line of defending humanity. We will always do that.
Jennifer.
I mean, MSF has a long history of speaking out about conflict when we see the limits of our medical action challenged. And when you are seeing day after day bombs being dropped on your patients, us being able to only serve a very small percentage of them is, as Christos said, a drop in the ocean of the need. And the way that we see being able to best save lives in Gaza and in Sudan today is for those bombs to stop dropping. And to my mind, that is not a political act. That is a medical act that follows the rationale of us trying to protect the people that we serve. And so we will use every tool in our toolbox to make sure that we can protect our patients in the best way possible. And that includes holding governments to account who are supporting the hurt that we are seeing in the places where we work.
Have you tried to get a meeting with a member of the cabinet, the Prime Minister perhaps, or the Foreign Minister to express this face-to-face?
Everywhere we are, and wherever we have a presence, be that an operational or institutional presence, we try to engage with everybody, and especially with the authorities. It was after I returned back from my visit also to Palestine that we drafted an open letter, and my colleagues engaged with the states and members of the states to explain the seriousness of the situation. And that was also escalated up to the United Nations Security Council. And also in the United States, we are holding regular meetings to bear and advocate for what we see. In closed doors, many times, because this has also to be like that. But what we try to do is to let them be fully aware of what we witness in the ground. And we are one of the very few that we have all this evidence that is based in our neutral assessment of the needs.
Do you expect a chance to meet with any representatives of government? It's a sitting day here in Canberra, so...
We will be chatting with Minister Wong tomorrow, and we have discussed the situation with her, giving a from-the-ground view of what's happening. We also have 85,000 signatures from Australian citizens with a statement of support towards the government, which we have shared with numerous government officials around the ceasefire in Gaza.
Our first question from the working press comes from Daniel Hurst.
Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. You mentioned that MSF is involved in helping the injured from the displaced people's camp in Rafah that was attacked the other day. What is the latest information you have about the types of injuries, the condition of the people, the sort of extent of that, of the damage and the injuries?
In that latest tragic incident, we happen to have our, we call it a stabilization treatment point. It's a small clinical facility very close to the place that was bombarded, very close to that informal camp with the tents. So we received more than 180 patients there now. The situation, as you can imagine, depends. Some of them are very severely injured, and some others couldn't even make it after a couple of hours. The numbers, the official numbers are everywhere now shared. We have, if I remember well, more than 30 or 40 killed people confirmed, and there are many more that they are still trying to assess where they are. But what is important in this question, and as I described the situation, is to understand that these little facilities are there to stabilize the patient and then refer them to there where they can get a more advanced surgical treatment. But these places do not exist anymore. There's nowhere that you can refer the patient. There's no trauma center anymore anywhere. There's no hospital. They're just partially functioning, and they are overwhelmed.
And what's your response to the Israeli government's first official explanation that it says it was targeting Hamas leaders nearby? Is that plausible?
Come again, please?
Is that plausible, or is that an acceptable explanation?
We try every day to describe the situation on the ground, and we bear the evidence, we share the evidence, we ask them to hold them into account, and then this is available for everyone who is qualified also to label this situation and make resolutions as they happened also in different courts.
And lastly, if I may, you wanted to
If I
respond.
can add to that, we're not going to comment on Israel's assessment of the threat, but I want to just remind everyone, we are talking about a refugee camp of tents. Who do you think are living in that camp? Mothers and children primarily. That was the target.
And the last thing I wanted to ask is, how frustrated is MSF? You've been conveying these messages for many months. I've spoken to some of your colleagues before about this, that the message hasn't really gotten through, or that there hasn't been any change in the situation on the ground.
Apparently not. No. Nothing changes. And that's why sometimes we feel like it's not for us anymore. That's why we address these political messages also. Our people are exhausted. They have crossed the line of being burned out. You can imagine now 8 months, working days and nights, witnessing all this, losing their members of their families, not being safe anywhere. I think we still try to find the words, we cannot find them. We still try to collect the evidence. Yes, it's not for us anymore.
Thank you.
Just to pick up on what Daniel was raising there, I mean, we have repeatedly heard this from the Israeli side that there are human shields, that Israel is intent on ensuring that Hamas is held to account, that there are in their view, examples that they can prove where hospitals have been used essentially to shield Hamas operations. Can you understand from their point of view, after what happened last year, their intention to try and rescue hostages and to rain down their fury on these groups?
Oh yes, of course. And of course we do understand that. What we ask is everyone to respect the laws of war. What we ask is everyone to respect those sacred places like hospitals. And hospitals have patients. Many times I have been asked, and I really have never heard anything from any of my colleagues about anything happening inside the hospital other than being full of patients. Patients that sometimes we have been asked to even evacuate within a couple of hours, which is impossible. So when you ask me of what is happening inside the hospitals, I can tell you that there is just a desperate situation full of patients, and that's what we see.
I think if you think about what the Israelis are going through and what Palestinians are going through, if you take it back to the humanitarianism of it, these are traumatized, hurting people on both sides of this conflict. And so from a human level, you can understand the rage and the hurt and the pain. But the civilian casualties that we are seeing are so outside the bounds of acceptability of any law of war that there is no way to contextualize it, to excuse it away, or to even be able to frame it in, even from that human understanding. The pain and suffering that we are seeing in this tiny little area where no one can run, no one can be evacuated, where the primary people suffering are mothers and children, make it very hard to make that, to take that rationale all the way to its conclusion of what happened in Rafah this week.
Nick Stewart.
You are saying essentially that Israel is now using the creation of a humanitarian catastrophe as a weapon of war. Firstly, is that correct? Secondly, if that is the case, what do you demand that Australia's government does? Australia still has some arrangements whereby we purchase equipment from Israeli companies, their military equipment. Would you like to see Australia immediately abandon any relationship with any Israeli companies, particularly in the defence area? And finally, you have made this cry from the heart. How do you feel when you hear about universities like the Australian National University, which says it wants to move the protest so that way the students will basically be not seen, not heard? What do you think of a university that says that it privileges this learning over protests?
Yeah.
Want to start first? No.
Regarding student protests, we see their pain. You can hear in Christos' voice, we are at the end of our capacity to be able to use words and rationale to stop the suffering. And so we understand people who are expressing solidarity and pain, and we certainly hope that that's being done in a respectful and caring way for anyone who is suffering in this conflict. And I think we'll leave it at that and let the universities and the students decide how to manage.
So not a lot of sympathy for the university?
I have sympathy for anyone who's trying to run a big organization, and I'm sure Christos does too, because it's not always black and white.
Yeah. So what we see on the ground is indeed siege, disproportional and indiscriminate bombardment of civilians, of kids. We see blockage of the humanitarian aid. We have seen attacks in our hospital facilities everywhere. We have lost colleagues. There's no one safe in Gaza. What does this mean? There are those that they are qualified to draw conclusions and make resolutions and rule. We will keep being there, standing by all the civilians and all the people that they are in need. We show empathy for everyone. We know what does it mean to be in pain. We know what does it mean to be a hostage. But at the same time, what we ask, first and foremost, is the respect of the laws of war, And more specifically, when it comes to your questions about different governments, be that the Australian one or not, is ceasefire. And please, we need an unimpeded humanitarian aid right now.
And you call upon Australia to diversify, to cut arms, any arms or related military agreements with Israel?
We cannot go to political solutions, because I think what you expect from doctors is to keep providing to you the evidence, and that's what we do. But now we are in a moment where we raise the alarm and we say it's not the humanitarians that can provide the solution. The solution is political. It's your responsibility. Start with the ceasefire. How you're going to do the ceasefire, you have to figure out. And what is your leverage? You, in Australia, in Europe, in the United States, in all over the world.
Is there a way to perhaps give a little bit of context here around, we've obviously been in a period of intense international conflict, what's happened in Ukraine, as well as, identifying conflicts that we hear very little about in Australia. But where does the situation in Gaza at the moment sit on that continuum of just, humanitarian impact?
That's a very, very nice question, because many times we try also not to compare context. Nothing is comparable. Every context has specificities, it's quite unique. What is common is the human suffering. It's always civilians that they pay the price more than anyone else. In Ukraine, although we don't speak these days, the war is going on, and people are being under what we call humanitarian catastrophe as well, especially in the very forefront line. But we've seen less impunity in the violations of the international humanitarian law than what we see in Gaza. We see kind of double standards, different reaction by different countries, and that is not helpful. At the same time, in Ukraine, we were all amazed and so excited to see how people expressed solidarity to people fleeing, to the Ukrainian refugees. But we would like to see the same from people fleeing from other places, seeking refuge in Europe. So all these double standards upset us a lot, and we would like the world to learn from one context and improve to the next one. That this does not happen. And then, of course, there are so many reasons why there is so much attention in this exceptional crisis in Palestine. But I tried to draw you an image, a picture that is really horrific of what has been happening more than a year now in Sudan. And Sudan, for my colleagues that they have known the context since more than 20 years now, they speak like Darfur 2.0. And in 2003, there was a genocide in Darfur. So we try to raise this awareness, and we try to ask from this international community to be more proportional in not only the response, but the attention first and foremost.
Did you want to add anything?
No, I think that was just fine.
Well, I guess perhaps a follow-on from that is just in terms of the obligation from a humanitarian and medical point of view that MSF might see on countries that potentially can provide support in terms of even the short term having, a humanitarian or visa approach. In Australia, that's quite contentious at the moment because there are great concerns about whether or not enough security checks are being done on people fleeing through the Rafah crossing out of Gaza. But do you have a view on whether or not countries outside of the region who have the ability to should be accepting more refugees, or at least people who want a short-term reprieve?
Let us start with those that they must desperately leave from Gaza at this right moment. They are the tens of thousands of heavily injured people that we cannot provide to them any help where they are. So this is what we call medical evacuation should come first. Then, of course, everyone should have the right to flee and seek safety. But the solution is not to find all those places that could welcome and accommodate 2.5 million people. That's a little bit distracting. That's why we go back to what matters more than anything at the moment is a ceasefire and humanitarian aid to come inside. And let's start from this, while at the same time evacuating the people that they are not going to make it. And these are the silent deaths that I tried to talk to you before. Every day we lose many people and they are not visible anywhere. They are not even in the hospitals. They go back in their tents and they die because of infected, complicated wounds, because of neglected diseases. That's where we have to focus now.
And from the Australian perspective, I mean, we have been stuck at a humanitarian visa cap for years now, and that must start to rise to meet the needs, the global needs that we're seeing. And we are also in this cycle of offshore processing, and you're hearing what we're talking about, you know, and the amount of trauma that the Sudanese who are fleeing are dealing with, the amount of trauma that, you know, the Rohingya are dealing with and fleeing, and then they arrive ostensibly to safety in Australia, and we re-traumatize them through offshore processing, through indefinite detention. And so we have to take a more human, a more generous, a more Australian spirit in the way that we are responding as a country to be able to meet the rising tide of humanitarian need.
Melissa Code.
Hi, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Thank you for your talk. The circumstances you describe sound impossible. And so you talk about the need for more moral responsibility, blatant breaches of international humanitarian law. My question is, if moral responsibility and the existing structures for legal redress clearly have got us to this impossible point, to this humanitarian crisis, is it sufficient? Do we need to seriously reconsider whether those instruments and architecture adequately exist to support humanitarian organisations like yourself do its work? And to that point, where are the bright lines for MSF? When does it say, we can't do this here in these circumstances, we're out?
Thanks for this question. And this is a question that we pose to ourselves every day. Either we are in our headquarters or there in the field. And we struggle to find out what would have more impact to the people that we are there for, and how much more we can compromise in order to be able to be there and stand by them. Sometimes we feel like the frogs in the boiling water. But at the same time, if there is one thing driving us, is that we should never abandon them. I've been there, many others of my colleagues have been there. Scarlett will share the same stories, that what they want, everywhere we are, be that in Sudan, be that in Gaza, be that in Ukraine, they want to know that people from the world stand in solidarity to them, they stand by them. And to us, this is the priority. So we will keep compromising. I don't know where exactly will be this line, but maybe the answer and the dilemma here is not should we stay or should we go in order to advocate more. Is how much more, maybe political or not, the different organizations could become, and how much they can push for accountability for the mechanisms that they already exist. Just they are in place, but they are not used. And how much we can hold accountable our governments, our societies in what is happening.
And if all these decisions can sort of be made at an international ICC level, but that mean nothing, what's your position on that?
I'm really saddened. I'm disappointed that we don't have. We were supposed to have rules, and we were supposed to comply with the rules. Now it's not up to us to either express an opinion on what is happening in this part. We would like to know that we are there where we should be, and the rest of the world respects and supports the humanitarian action, which is apparently not the case. Okay, we will keep doing what we can.
I think, you know, what we are seeing from an international humanitarian law perspective is that it's being absolutely trounced. And every single day, we have to make choices on a ground that is breaking up beneath our feet as we go. And so when we send international staff, Australians, New Zealanders, many of whom have been over the last months and continue to go in, we expect the rules of war to be respected and that we're not sending in Scarlet and others to be bombed. We're not going to get into the functionality of the mechanisms that hold people accountable for that because, frankly, we're focused on the humanitarian part of that. But if there is no accountability for IHL, we are all in trouble.
So this word has been used quite, broadly over recent times, and it has been contested internationally. But from what you know, and medically, is this a genocide in your view?
The ICJ in January has ruled that there is a plausible genocide. It is not my words, it's what we all read. What we can tell you by being on the ground, by have been every day there witnessing, experiencing, treating, is that nothing has happened and nothing has changed in order to prevent this. And this is what we will keep hearing from us. And whenever anything changes, we will also be here to tell you that, okay, now that's what we need.
And since May 9th, it's gotten worse. So plausible genocide was said out loud. There is now less food aid, less fuel, less water, and an acceleration of all of the elements that the ICJ has been talking about as elements of a plausible genocide. That's all we can say.
Nick Coatsworth.
Nick Coatsworth, 9 News. Just to start with, Scarlett, Christos and Jennifer, thank you for what you're doing. I'm incredibly proud to have ever had an association with the MSF because of what you're doing here today and what you've done, Scarlett, in Gaza, so thank you. My question, Christos, you started in 2002, your MSF journey. I started mine in 2004. In 2007, as I was about to go to Zelenge, which you visited in Darfur, there was wall-to-wall coverage, and it was in the post-genocide period. Wall-to-wall coverage on the 24-hour news cycle that I was watching in my hotel room as I was waiting to get my visa in Paris. Now we see almost nothing. And yet, as you described it, this is Darfur 2.0, with 725,000 displaced people and one child in refugee camps dying every hour from malnutrition. What has changed in this world between 2007 and 2024 to make it so?
Oh, thanks, Nick. That's a question that, yes, I don't know. You will start first.
I think journalism has changed. I mean, we work very closely with journalists, and I think that the international desks have changed. There's less funding, there are less people on the ground, there are less researchers. There's just less capability for journalists to be able to report. We hear it all the time, and it's not for lack of wanting to, and it's not for lack of desire to be reporting on those things. Social media, obviously, is another thing. You have your just not, one humanitarian focus. You have 15 across social media, so it's splitting eyes. Populism, all of these things are really contributing to our ability to be able to break through in stories. For those of you who don't know, MSF was founded by doctors and journalists, and so we really have been an organization that has its basis in reporting. And our team does an amazing job of getting the stories out there, but I think we would love to see news agencies reinvesting back in the international and developing world so that we can talk about this more from a first-person account.
We had this discussion a couple of weeks ago in Geneva, and it was titled Good Victims, Bad Victims. So we posed this question back to colleagues of ours, journalists. We said, what has changed? And indeed, what Jennifer mentioned is one of the three key factors I identified. The other one was that there was no presence on the ground, no boots, as we say, on the ground by different international organizations or United Nations agencies. And even the UN agencies accepted. When I invited them in an event, and there were all the heads of the UN, they acknowledged that they have been quite conservative due to security reasons in responding, or even just being present on the ground. When you don't have these eyes, you cannot get alerted of what is happening. And things were happening. The third factor was the lack of political willingness by anyone at this moment to get involved in the situation or try to resolve the situation. The combination of three things created a raising humanitarian crisis that there was no one else to see that early enough. That's when MSF came with this nutrition survey and said, one kid every few hours dying. And immediately afterwards, there was a response, especially by journalists. They arrived. Was that enough? No, because the agencies didn't come. The money didn't come. And still they have serious problems with the funds. That is why it is still for MSF to supply the 70 or 80% of water in most of these places. Okay, we developed this expertise, but we would like to focus on medical activities and others take this over. So this is what I think has changed since 2007 that you was there, Nick.
Thank you both.
Are you concerned about the dehumanisation of certain people in some conflicts?
We are very, very cognizant of the way that we represent the people that we support with medical care. And I think it's really important that you represent patients with dignity in all contexts. And I think in the past, certainly that hasn't always been the case. There's been a real victimization of patients. And when I think about, you know, the sort of former imagery of desperate parents and skinny children and famine, what is standing behind that child is a mother who just walked for 4 days to find her child medical care. And so what we are trying to do as an organization is make sure that we tell her story about her strength and her child's strength and the people standing behind them and the community fighting to survive every day. And so yes, we are very concerned about it, but we are also look inward to make sure that we're doing representation well first.
In the biggest of the humanitarian crises that we've been present or responded in all these more than 50 years, digging behind and trying to understand the problem, it was indeed the dehumanization by fellow human beings, be that Rwanda, Srebrenica, even nowadays. And then, of course, in a different scale, when we look at the people fleeing, the migrants, the language we use again, this is what is the start, the cause of the problems. When we don't look at each other as equal, when we don't look at each other as human beings, when we cannot even dare to say that no matter what, we have to stand by each other, then what we see is all of us to be really co-opted in very anti-humane narratives, in a very populist demagogic way, and that's what we see everywhere. And this can go so wrong sometimes, and out of the sudden you can see thousands of people being killed. That's the everyday reality of MSF. That's why we keep repeating the very basic language of humanity, the very basic message of solidarity, through medical action, of course.
Brendan Shaw.
Thank you for your talk. Brendan Shaw from Shoreview Consulting, and also with the Pharmacy School at the University of Sydney. And I want to start by thanking you, MSF, for all the work you do on the ground over many years in different countries. It's been inspirational to see, so thank you for that. My question's about actually the people who work for you and with you in situations. You mentioned before that now hospitals and clinics are starting to become targets for some of these things, and we've seen ambulances being targeted as well. I'm just wondering actually about the healthcare professionals who work with you, the doctors, the nurses and those. How do you, as an organisation at a practical level, how do you protect those people? How do you look after them? And also, how does that affect recruitment? I mean, to try and get people on the ground to work in these situations, how does that affect your organisation?
It's getting worse and worse. It's not only what I described to you today in Gaza. We have documented more than 1,000 attacks in health facilities in Ukraine. We have experienced in 2015 the bombing of one of our trauma centers in Kunduz by the United States Air Force. We've lost colleagues, and we've lost patients that were sedated inside the ICU. You saw them getting burned. This is the reality. Many responded, reacted, and governments, progressive, like Australians, one like Japanese, and we ended up having the 2286, if I remember well, resolution in the United Nations to protect. We came with campaigns, the Not a Target campaign. But after what we see nowadays, I don't know, we may need to change course. We may need to look differently in all this situation. With this impunity, many of my colleagues say that Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza has become the graveyard of the laws of the war. So I don't know what's going to look like tomorrow in everywhere we go. I don't know.
I've worked for MSF on and off for 20 years, and we used to have conversations with supporters, and they would say, how do you keep people safe? And I would explain, well, we negotiate with all sides of the conflict, and we educate the community about who we are, and the community deeply cares about having medical care, and that really protects us. And now I feel like Pollyanna, having said that. I mean, we're now seeing that is there are much lesser guarantee of safety, and I think that Gaza is the extreme context of that. So, Scarlett and I had some conversations before she went off. We make sure that people are very, very, very aware that if you suffer a medical incident in Gaza, we cannot get you out until the Israeli authorities say it's okay, and they might not, get you out for a while. If you have a mental health issue, which in that circumstance would not be a surprise, we cannot get you out. I mean, the permissions, the bureaucracy, the blockages to be able to move people. We have to talk about mental health. We have to talk about care when people return. That's for international staff. But now we have to think about the 400 staff that we have working in Palestine, and what are our obligations to them? What is our duty of care to them? I mean, this is an exceptional circumstance, and so this is one of the questions that we're asking ourselves. Many of them want out. Of course they do. It's hell on earth for them and their families. How do we support them in the best way possible in what is a really impossible circumstance?
Just finally, there is a statement today from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, about what's occurred in the last 24 hours, again calling for a humanitarian ceasefire to protect civilians, saying that the strikes from Israel have had horrific and unacceptable consequences, calling for Israel not to proceed with its operation in Rafah, and calling on Hamas to release all hostages and stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields and lay down its arms. You've seen the international response and the way different leaders and governments have responded. So what do you make of our government's response? How would you characterise it?
I am happy to hear the language coming out of Minister Wong's office. I think it's really important. Those words matter. It matters that the Australian government leads. But I would encourage us also then to look at action as well. So when there are UN Security Council resolutions on Russia because of Ukraine, what are the actions that the government of Australia has taken? When there's a UN security resolution regarding Israel and the conflict in Gaza, what are the actions that they are taking? I'm not going to sit here and list them, but I think it's a really good story for somebody to write about what the response of the government is, and we want to see them take the most thorough response possible within the UN security, within the UN community that can be taken.
Yeah, I think everyone is horrified, and I've seen that everyone shifted their language on this, but where is the action? And there must be an action. And as I said before, it's not for the humanitarians anymore. There must be this political solution. And I think every single part of different sides in this world, be that in Australia, in Europe, or US and Canada, there is a leverage there. Things can start with the very basic measures of having a ceasefire, having the humanitarian aid in, and then I'm sure that we will find our steps.
Just briefly, do you have faith in Israel to investigate actions like this itself without external involvement?
Actions like? No, I think it has to be external involvement, of course.
We're out of time, so please join me in thanking our guests. We do have here a membership to the press club here.
Oh, wow.
And it gets you into other press clubs across the world, so you will have a chance to perhaps visit them, and also the car park here, as Morris likes me to say.
Wow.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much for being here.